and Doves: South Dakota's Reaction to the Vietnam War by Amy Alcock and Amanda Greenmeyer.
Hold it just one moment. There is another way. Stop! Hell no, we won't go! 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 Hell no, we won't go!
The Vietnam War started in the early 60s, when Vietnam had just become its own country. President Kennedy took precautions to protect the new country from the growing threat of the communists in Southeast Asia after the Korean War, but it was to no avail when news spread of attacks in North Vietnam. When the president of South Vietnam, Ngo Diem, imprisoned all citizens he suspected of being communist, it didn't take long to realize he made a grave mistake. The Reds gained many supporters in South Vietnam.
The White House knew it had to make a decision, and the possible threat of communism spreading throughout the world loomed over their heads. Should the U.S. help South Vietnam defeat the communist invasion? When 2 U.S. ships were attacked off the coast of Vietnam in neutral water when Lyndon B. Johnson was in office, that finalized his decision to engage U.S. Army troops in the Vietnam War in 1965, called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution.
Many people supported the war, but spoke out less than citizens against it. They believed that the United States should be fighting for the South Vietnamese so that communism did not spread any further than it had in the Korean War.
Some hawks just believed it was their duty to fight in the war, because their country needed them to. Others had opinions quite the opposite.
These people were called Doves. They were opposed to our involvement in the war.
This was the first time the U.S. had experienced a war in their own homes. Walter Cronkite reported attacks and deaths on 6 o'clock news every night.
Whole families saw gruesome pictures of the war front and experienced terrifying videos. This strengthened what the Doves stood for.
There were Doves that barely stood out, and others that made their opposition to the Vietnam War vividly known.
Most of the Doves were of a younger generation, so college campuses were breeding grounds to anti-war movements. As the war dragged on, protesting grew from innocent opinions to violent rallies. On May 4, 1970, 500 students at Kent State University in Ohio gathered at the center of campus to protest the war. Police were called when the mob began to get out of hand, and the National Guard had to step in. They fired 67 rounds in 13 seconds in the direction of the crowd, and while 9 students lay injured, 5 lay dead.
In the beginning of 1970, President Nixon expanded the war's fighting ground into Cambodia to destroy North Vietnamese bases located in the country.
In 73, a peace treaty was agreed upon, and the participants were called to a ceasefire as the United States withdrew all of its forces.
Because South Dakota is mainly made up of small towns, we have a more conservative way of life than cities. The general population supported the nation's involvement in the war.
Most of the Doves in one place were attending the University of South Dakota, a liberal arts university that had one of the loudest voices protesting the war in the state. But unlike most of the students from colleges in other states, USD did not hold peace rallies. South Dakotans who never fought in the war worked in many professions, such as working in shoe repair shops, drilling wells, and managing farm equipment, but their strong opinions on the war brought them together.
Most recall thinking that the United States shouldn't have been involved.
Virginia Anderson was in college during the early 70s. She stated she was against the war, but, in truth, admitted she did not know what she was protesting against.
Karen Devine was a college student attending USD during the time of the war. Although she was a Dove and strongly opposed to the war, she did not like protesting.
Vietnam veterans remember also disapproving the protesters' actions, and almost all of them still have strong feelings about them today. Dave Dabercow, a veteran, stated his opinion on the protesters. Very unpatriotic, regardless of what they were saying to make their point. They wanted to enjoy freedom at someone else's expense. Mike Forrester, who served in the U.S. Air Force, also graduated from Kent State College, where the shooting at the students took place. He believed they were out of line. Two of his classmates were proclaimed to be shooters in the protests that went awry. Soldiers fighting were not against the war, they were doing their duty. When asked about what he thought about the war effort, Mr. Forrester said, "I didn't think about it. I was in the military. You did what you were told. My friends went and served."
The United States veterans returning home from the Vietnam War had little to celebrate after their life-changing job serving. When they came home, it was another struggle.
Jim Tischer, a retired teacher from Sisseton High School and a military intelligence veteran of the Vietnam War, returned home and attended his hometown church with his grandmother one Sunday. During the sermon, the pastor referred to all of the Vietnam vets as baby killers. He said he learned that it was best to keep his Vietnam experiences to himself.
When veteran Mike Kraft was flying back to the United States, he was told to change into civilian clothes, so he would not stand out as a soldier at the airport. For the next 35 years, he bottled up his emotions concerning Vietnam.
They were often not congratulated for their courage, nor recognized for their service. Life went on with no notice of what they underwent. They were not recognized in any homecoming parades, and were even afraid to wear their military uniforms in public. Veterans talked very little about their experiences in the war, even with close family and friends. Larry Schuster stated, "No one seemed to care."
Veterans did not receive the proper care for physical injuries as well as mental ones. Many soldiers suffered from post-traumatic stress that resulted in addictions that were not tended to as well.
Also, those who served in the Vietnam War had significantly less benefits than those who had previously served in World War II.
Agent Orange was distributed by airplane under military command into the enemy territory during the war. This substance was a pesticide that quickly killed all vegetation it hit. Because of being exposed to this defoliant, veterans had many health problems years after the war ended.
The capital of South Dakota, Pierre, finally realized they must show their appreciation for the Vietnam veterans in 2006. They held a belated memorial service for those who served in the war. They dedicated statues and a parade in their honor and memory.
Veteran Mike Kraft recalls that he never spoke or opened up about the war. He attended the memorial service in Pierre, and that made him want to share his story.
Today, veterans are treated much differently. Though we don't always agree with the reasons we enter war affairs, we must support our troops. Veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars are warmly welcomed back to their home country with celebratory homecomings.
Although many people were greatly impacted by the war, whether it was recalling losing a loved one or their experiences in Vietnam itself, in the words of Bonnie Gherkin, a housewife at the time, it was just a bad time for the whole country. But, as with every situation, we learn to look ahead to a better future.